It's April 4th, 2024, and the morning mist is lifting from the abandoned industrial landscape of Dale in Manchester, England. Urban explorers are drawn to this forgotten corner of the city, where remnants of Britain's industrial past crumble quietly among patches of reclaimed green space. The area carries the weight of history, once home to some of the country's most notorious slums, now transformed into wetlands and nature reserves that few people visit. But on this particular morning, someone exploring the Cold War-era bunker hidden among the overgrown vegetation discovers something that will transform Manchester's quiet spring into a citywide nightmare. Wrapped carefully in cellophane and concealed within the concrete walls is a human torso, the first piece of a puzzle that will reveal one of the most disturbing betrayals in recent British criminal history. As investigators begin their work, they have no idea that scattered across Manchester's parks, reservoirs and forgotten spaces are more remains from the same victim. They don't know that somewhere in the city, a man has been living a double life for weeks, impersonating his victim while methodically disposing of evidence one shopping bag at a time. Keep this image of body parts scattered across an entire city in mind as we explore this story, because what starts as a missing person case will evolve into a tale of financial desperation, calculated murder, and a betrayal so complete that it continued long after the victim's death. The man responsible would become known to Manchester police as Heavy Bagman, but his real identity would shock everyone who thought they knew him. Manchester in 2024 remains a city defined by contrasts, gleaming modern developments rising alongside Victorian industrial architecture, trendy neighbourhoods bordering areas that still bear the scars of economic decline. Dale represents one of these forgotten corners, a place where history has been deliberately erased and nature allowed to reclaim what industry once dominated. The bunker where the first remains were discovered sits like a concrete monument to Cold War paranoia, designed to protect local officials in the event of nuclear attack, but now serving only as shelter for urban wildlife and the occasional explorer seeking glimpses of forgotten Manchester. When the first torso was found, Manchester police immediately understood they were dealing with a homicide. Bodies don't dismember themselves and carefully wrap individual parts in plastic before distributing them across multiple locations. This level of methodical disposal suggested someone with both the physical capability to perform dismemberment and the psychological detachment necessary to handle human remains over an extended period. The discovery triggered a massive investigation that would eventually span 19 separate crime scenes across Greater Manchester. But on that first morning, investigators had no victim identification, no suspect information, and no understanding of the scope of what they were dealing with. Think of this initial discovery like finding a single piece of an enormous jigsaw puzzle. You know it's part of something larger and more complex, but you have no idea what the complete picture will reveal. In the age of surveillance capitalism, few crimes occur without leaving some digital footprint. Manchester's extensive CCTV network, combined with doorbell cameras and traffic monitoring systems, creates a web of observation that captures most movement through the city. Investigators began the painstaking process of reviewing thousands of hours of footage, looking for anything that might explain how human remains had appeared in scattered locations across the city. What they found was both revealing and mysterious: a lone figure moving through Manchester's streets carrying heavy shopping bags that appeared to strain under their weight. The surveillance footage showed a man who seemed completely ordinary, blending seamlessly into the urban landscape as he went about what appeared to be routine errands. But the timing of his movements, the apparent weight of his bags, and the routes he took through the city created a pattern that investigators found deeply suspicious. In one particularly clear piece of footage, the man could be seen carrying a teal-coloured heavy-duty shopping bag that seemed to match the description of materials found at the bunker site. His casual demeanour as he moved through busy commercial areas was chilling. Dozens of people passed within meters of him, completely unaware that they were sharing sidewalk space with human remains. Unable to identify the man from the footage, investigators gave him a nickname that would become synonymous with the case: Heavy Bagman. The moniker captured both the practical reality of what they observed in the surveillance footage and the methodical nature of the crimes they were investigating. While Manchester police were developing their understanding of Heavy Bagman's movements, they were simultaneously working to identify the victim, whose remains had been scattered across the city. DNA analysis of the torso found in Kersal Bunker revealed no matches in the National Police database, suggesting someone who had lived a law-abiding life without serious criminal involvement. But DNA alone couldn't tell them who this person was, what their life had been like, or why someone had chosen to kill them in such a brutal and systematic way. The victim was Stuart Everett, though he had been born Roman Giamacchi to Polish parents who had endured extraordinary hardships during World War II. His parents had been captured and spent 2 brutal years in Soviet concentration camps before escaping to build new lives in Britain. This background of survival against impossible odds had shaped Stuart's approach to life and his deep appreciation for community and service. Stuart had chosen to change his name from Roman to Stuart as a way of embracing his British identity while still honouring his Polish heritage. To friends and family, he was known simply as Benny, a nickname that captured his warm, approachable personality. Throughout his working life, Stuart had dedicated himself to public service, spending years working for both the NHS and the Department for Work and Pensions. Colleagues remembered him as someone who genuinely cared about the people he served, treating his work not just as a job but as a calling to help others navigate difficult circumstances. By his mid-60s, health problems, including a stroke, had forced Stuart to step back from full-time employment. The stroke had left him dependent on a walking stick for mobility, but it hadn't diminished his commitment to helping others or his involvement in his community. Rather than retreating into isolation after his health setbacks, Stuart had thrown himself even more deeply into serving Manchester's Polish immigrant community. He ran weekly English classes, helping newly arrived immigrants not just learn the language, but develop the confidence and connections necessary to build successful lives in Britain. This work was more than volunteer service for Stuart. It was a continuation of his family's story of survival and adaptation. Having grown up hearing about his parents' struggles to build new lives after escaping the Soviet camps, Stuart understood intimately the challenges faced by people trying to establish themselves in a foreign country. His 3-bedroom house on Worsley Road in Salford had become an informal community centre where Polish immigrants could find not just language instruction, but also practical advice, emotional support, and a sense of belonging. Stuart rented out the other 2 bedrooms to fellow Polish migrants, creating a household that served as both his home and a launching pad for others seeking to establish themselves in Manchester. This generosity and community focus would prove to be both Stuart's greatest strength and ultimately his fatal vulnerability. Among the Polish immigrants who found shelter and support in Stuart's household was Marson Makovich, a man whose relationship with Stuart would evolve from grateful tenant to trusted friend to, ultimately, calculating killer. Marson had first met Stuart more than a decade before moving into his house, establishing a relationship built on Stuart's characteristic generosity and Marson's apparent appreciation for the older man's guidance and support. When Marson's romantic relationship ended in 2017, Stuart offered him one of the bedrooms in the Worsley Road house. The arrangement seemed to benefit both men. Stuart gained a reliable tenant and companion who could help with household tasks that had become more difficult since his stroke. Marson gained affordable housing and access to Stuart's network of community connections and support services. Over time, their relationship deepened beyond that of typical landlord and tenant. Friends and neighbours observed that they seemed particularly close, and Stuart himself described Marson as his partner in private communications. Despite the significant age gap, Stuart was about 25 years older than Marson, there appeared to be genuine affection and intimacy between them. But this apparent closeness concealed a dynamic that was far more parasitic than reciprocal. While Stuart continued to offer support, guidance, and resources, Marson was developing an increasingly exploitative attitude toward the relationship. Think of their relationship like a symbiotic system where one organism provides all the nutrients while the other contributes nothing. Eventually, the host becomes weakened while the parasite grows stronger and more demanding. By 2023, Marson's financial situation had deteriorated into complete chaos. He had taken out multiple loans totaling more than £60,000, money that he spent as quickly as he borrowed it without any apparent plan for repayment. When his ability to secure additional loans dried up, he had maxed out credit cards for another £14,000, creating a total debt burden that represented several years of typical working-class income. Rather than addressing this crisis through increased work or financial counselling, Marson made a decision that revealed his fundamental character. He simply quit his job in November 2023 and stopped making any effort to earn legitimate income. This wasn't someone overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. This was someone who had made deliberate choices to accumulate debt and then deliberately chosen to abandon any responsibility for addressing the consequences. Living rent-free in Stuart's house while contributing nothing to household expenses or his own debt obligations, Marson spent his days with no apparent purpose or plan beyond avoiding the reality of his financial situation. But as the pressure from creditors intensified and his options for legitimate solutions diminished, Marson began developing a different kind of plan, one that would allow him to solve his financial problems by eliminating the person who had helped him most. The murder of Stuart Everett wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of desperate panic. It was a calculated decision made by someone who had systematically evaluated his options and concluded that killing his friend and benefactor was preferable to taking responsibility for his own choices. On the evening of March 27, 2024, Stuart settled into his bedroom to watch a football match, relaxing in his pajamas after what had presumably been an ordinary day. He had no reason to suspect that the man he'd welcomed into his home, supported through difficult times, and treated as family was preparing to murder him. Marson's attack was swift and brutal. Armed with a hammer, he approached Stuart from behind and struck him at least 4 times on the head and back of the skull, with enough force to fracture bone and cause immediate catastrophic brain injury. The forensic evidence later revealed that Stuart survived the initial attack long enough to draw several laboured breaths. Blood found in his lungs confirmed that he remained alive for at least a few moments after the assault, but the damage to his skull was so severe that death was inevitable. This brief survival period makes the crime even more tragic. Stuart may have had enough consciousness in his final moments to understand that he was being killed by someone he trusted completely. What happened next revealed the full extent of Marson's psychological detachment from normal human empathy. Rather than panicking, fleeing, or showing any signs of remorse, he immediately began the methodical process of disposing of Stuart's body in a way that would prevent identification and delay discovery. Using a knife and hacksaw, Marson spent hours dismembering Stuart's corpse in the bedroom where he'd been killed. The process required sustained physical effort and psychological endurance that most people would find impossible, but Marson approached it like a logistics problem to be solved. Body parts were carefully wrapped in plastic film and divided into packages small enough to be transported inconspicuously in shopping bags and luggage. This wasn't someone acting in a state of psychological breakdown. This was someone executing a plan that had been thought through in advance. The dismemberment process is like a factory operation, where a single input is systematically broken down into component parts for efficient distribution. The clinical nature of Marson's approach reveals someone who had completely dehumanized his victim and was treating human remains as nothing more than waste to be disposed of. Over the following week, Marson embarked on what can only be described as a systematic body disposal operation that spanned the entire Greater Manchester area. Police would later determine that he made at least 11 separate trips from the Worsley Roadhouse, each time carrying shopping or travel bags containing human remains. His chosen disposal sites revealed careful planning and local knowledge. He targeted quiet corners of North Manchester and Salford, focusing on secluded parks, forgotten open spaces, abandoned structures, and the still waters around Blackleach Reservoir. The Easter weekend presented a logistical challenge, as the holiday brought increased foot traffic to many of the locations Marson had been using for disposal. Rather than risking discovery, he made the calculated decision to store remaining body parts in the household freezer until public areas became less crowded. This pause in the disposal process demonstrates the methodical nature of his approach. He was treating the situation like a business operation, where efficiency and risk management took precedence over any normal human emotions like guilt or urgency. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Marson took the additional step of separating Stuart's face from his skull in an attempt to prevent identification of the remains if they were discovered. This level of premeditation reveals someone who understood forensic investigation techniques and was taking specific steps to complicate any potential investigation. Killing and dismembering Stuart was only the beginning of Marson's betrayal. What followed was a comprehensive identity theft operation that demonstrated both the depth of his planning and the complete absence of any human decency or remorse. Marson already knew the password to Stuart's phone, a detail that reveals how completely Stuart had trusted him. Using this access, he began sending text messages to Stuart's family members, pretending to be Stuart and claiming that he had moved back to Derby and was too unwell to take phone calls. The messages were crafted to explain Stuart's sudden absence while discouraging family members from attempting direct contact, a strategy that bought Marson weeks of time before anyone became suspicious enough to investigate. But the deception went far beyond simple text messages. Marson began systematically looting Stuart's financial accounts, treating his murder victims' resources as his personal treasury. He made regular ATM withdrawals and used Stuart's money to purchase fast food and other personal items while continuing to live in Stuart's house. When family members became suspicious about Stuart's supposed relocation, Marson took the elaborate step of visiting an open house, showing and recording video footage to make it appear that Stuart was living in a new location. He even sent birthday cards to Stuart's family members, maintaining the illusion that Stuart was alive and well in his new circumstances. The physical evidence of Stuart's murder required extensive cleanup efforts that Marson approached with the same methodical planning he had used for the disposal operation. He hired a skip company using Stuart's money to dispose of the victims' belongings, telling both the landlord and the other housemate that Stuart had left and his family had collected his possessions. The blood-soaked carpet in Stuart's bedroom presented a particular challenge. When bleach and cleaning products proved insufficient to remove the stains, Marson cut out the contaminated section and replaced it with carpet from Stuart's own room. He then hid the blood-stained piece under his bed, apparently forgetting to dispose of it properly. This oversight would later provide crucial forensic evidence, as the blood had soaked through the carpet padding and into the floorboards beneath, creating a contamination pattern that no amount of cleaning could completely eliminate. Marson disposed of the hammer and hacksaw used in the murder by throwing them into Blackleach Reservoir, where police divers would later recover them with Stuart's blood still detectable on the blade. Throughout this cover-up process, Marson maintained his normal routines and interactions with neighbours and acquaintances, showing no outward signs of stress or guilt about what he had done. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Marson's post-murder behaviour was his willingness to impersonate Stuart during phone conversations with family members and service providers. When Stuart's pension company required verification, Marson actually called them and spoke in a slurred voice, mimicking the speech patterns of someone recovering from a stroke. This performance required not just criminal audacity but also intimate knowledge of Stuart's medical condition and personal circumstances. Marson was essentially using Stuart's health problems, the very vulnerabilities that had made him dependent on others' help, as tools for continued exploitation after death. The pension impersonation was part of a broader financial exploitation scheme that saw Marson attempting to access every possible source of income associated with Stuart's identity. He wasn't just stealing money, he was systematically strip-mining Stuart's entire financial existence. Think of this behaviour like a sophisticated computer virus that doesn't just steal data, but continues operating using the host system's resources long after causing fatal damage. Marson had essentially turned Stuart's identity into a financial instrument that continued generating income even after its original owner was dead. By late April 2024, Marson had begun researching rental properties in Alicante, Spain, suggesting that he was planning to abandon his life in Manchester and start fresh abroad using money stolen from Stuart's accounts. This plan would have meant abandoning not just the scene of his crime but also his own children and former partner who remained in the Manchester area. The timing of this planned departure reveals someone who understood that his deception couldn't continue indefinitely and was preparing to extract himself from the situation before his lies were discovered. Meanwhile, neighbours around the Worsley Roadhouse were beginning to notice Stuart's complete absence from his normal routines. Where they had once seen him tending his garden or walking to local shops, there was now only silence and no visible activity. These observations hadn't yet crystallised into formal complaints or missing person reports, but they represented the kind of community awareness that might eventually have led to questions about Stuart's whereabouts. On April 25, 2024, Investigation Support Officer Claire Delly was conducting routine patrols in a Manchester residential area when she spotted a man who looked remarkably similar to the heavy Bagman figure from the surveillance footage that had been circulated to all officers. Acting on her training and instincts, Delly alerted uniformed colleagues while discreetly following the suspect to maintain visual contact until backup could arrive. When additional officers reached the scene, they shadowed Marson onto a public bus before making their arrest. The timing of this identification was extraordinary. Marson was planning to move out of the Worsley Roadhouse that very day, and his research into Spanish properties suggested that he might have been preparing to flee the country entirely. If Officer Delly hadn't recognised him when she did, Marson might have successfully escaped to Spain with Stuart's money, leaving behind a murdered friend whose remains were scattered across Manchester without any clear suspect to pursue. This moment of recognition represents one of those crucial instances where good police work and pure chance combined to prevent a criminal from escaping justice entirely. Once Marson was in custody and investigators had connected him to Stuart's disappearance, the evidence against him became overwhelming. The Worsley Road house revealed blood contamination that extended from the bedroom carpet through the padding and into the wooden floorboards beneath. Under ultraviolet light examination, additional blood traces were found throughout the house, creating a contamination pattern that clearly indicated where the murder had taken place and how the cleanup had been attempted. DNA analysis of the freezer revealed traces matching Stuart's genetic profile, confirming that body parts had been stored there during the disposal process. The hacksaw recovered from Blackleach Reservoir contained Stuart's blood on the blade, providing direct physical evidence linking Marson to the dismemberment. Perhaps most damning of all, divers searching the reservoir found Stuart's skull, which had been broken into 4 separate pieces during the hammer attack and then scattered into different areas of the water. A forensic pathologist was able to reconstruct the skull and confirm that the damage pattern was consistent with the type of hammer that Marson had purchased before the murder. The investigation ultimately encompassed 19 separate crime scenes, more than 2,000 hours of surveillance footage analysis, over 3,000 physical exhibits, and statements from more than 450 witnesses. This massive evidentiary foundation made it virtually impossible for Marson to mount any credible defense. When Marson's case came to trial, his defense team faced an impossible task. The physical evidence, digital records, witness testimony, and forensic analysis all pointed unambiguously to his guilt, leaving no reasonable doubt about what had happened. Even the birthday card that Marson had sent to Stuart's family while impersonating him provided evidence. Handwriting analysis confirmed it was written by Marson, and his fingerprints were found all over the paper. The prosecution was able to demonstrate clear motive through Marson's financial records, showing his massive debt burden and complete lack of legitimate income. They established opportunity through his residence in Stuart's house and access to his personal information, and they proved means through the physical evidence linking him to both the murder and the disposal of remains. Throughout the trial, Marson continued to deny any involvement in Stuart's death, claiming the entire case was based on misunderstandings. But the jury saw through these denials quickly, finding him guilty of murder after deliberating on 3 weeks of evidence. The judge sentenced Marson to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 34 years, meaning he will be at least 76 years old before becoming eligible for parole consideration. This sentence reflects both the severity of the murder itself and the aggravating factors of dismemberment, identity theft, and the complete betrayal of trust involved. Despite the massive investigation and the recovery of evidence from 19 different locations across Manchester, only approximately 1/3 of Stuart's remains have been found. This means that more than 2/3 of his body is still scattered across unknown locations in the Greater Manchester area. This incomplete recovery represents an ongoing tragedy for Stuart's family, who cannot achieve complete closure while knowing that parts of their loved one remain undiscovered. It also suggests that Marson's disposal operation was even more extensive than investigators were able to document. Marson has remained completely uncooperative with authorities, refusing to provide any information about additional disposal sites or the locations of missing remains. This final act of cruelty ensures that Stuart's family will continue to suffer uncertainty and incomplete grief for years to come. The scattered remains also represent a potential ongoing discovery problem for Manchester residents, as construction projects, landscaping work, or natural erosion could potentially expose additional body parts at unpredictable times and locations. The murder of Stuart Everett represents more than just the loss of one individual. It was the destruction of a community resource that had benefited countless Polish immigrants seeking to build new lives in Manchester. Stuart's weekly English classes, his informal counselling and support services, and his role as a cultural bridge between the immigrant community and broader British society all ended with his death. The people who had depended on his guidance and assistance were left without support at the very moment they learned about his tragic fate. The 3-bedroom house on Worsley Road that had served as an informal community centre is now empty, its role in Manchester's Polish immigrant network permanently severed. The relationships, programmes and support systems that Stuart had built over years of dedicated service died with him. This broader community impact illustrates how a single act of violence can ripple outward to affect entire networks of people who depended on the victim's generosity and service. Beyond the personal tragedy of Stuart's murder, Marson's crimes also destroyed decades of family history and financial resources that could never be recovered. When he hired the Skip Company to dispose of Stuart's belongings, he threw away wedding photos, birth certificates, historical documents, and family memorabilia that represented irreplaceable connections to Stuart's Polish heritage. Stuart had served as the family historian and document keeper, maintaining records that connected his siblings and relatives to their parents' wartime experiences and their family's journey from Poland to Britain. All of this documentation was carelessly discarded as part of Marson's cover-up operation. The financial theft was equally devastating, as Marson systematically drained Stuart's savings, pension accounts, and other resources that represented a lifetime of careful financial planning and self-discipline. These losses compound the emotional trauma of Stuart's murder by ensuring that his family lost not just their loved one, but also their connection to their own history and heritage. Marson Makovich's behaviour throughout this case reveals a psychological profile that combines financial desperation with complete absence of empathy or moral reasoning. His willingness to murder someone who had shown him nothing but kindness and support demonstrates a level of selfishness that approaches sociopathy. The methodical nature of his post-murder behaviour, the careful dismemberment, systematic disposal, elaborate impersonation, and sustained deception suggests someone capable of compartmentalizing extreme violence while maintaining normal social interactions. Perhaps most disturbing is his apparent complete lack of remorse or cooperation even after conviction. His refusal to provide information about missing remains shows that he continues to inflict suffering on Stuart's family even from prison. This psychological profile represents someone who views other people purely as resources to be exploited rather than as human beings deserving of respect and consideration. In retrospect, there were warning signs that might have alerted people to Marson's dangerous potential. His massive debt accumulation, followed by complete abandonment of any effort to address his financial responsibilities, showed a pattern of avoiding consequences for his choices. His decision to quit working rather than face his financial problems revealed someone who preferred to live parasitically off others rather than take responsibility for his own circumstances. The combination of financial desperation and proximity to a vulnerable, trusting victim created a situation where violence became possible for someone with Marson's psychological makeup. But these warning signs were subtle and would have been difficult for Stuart to recognise, especially given his generous nature and commitment to helping others. Stuart's greatest strength, his willingness to support people in difficult circumstances, ultimately became the vulnerability that Marson exploited. Stuart Everett's life should be remembered not for the horrific way it ended, but for the decades of service and generosity that defined his character. His work with the NHS and Department for Work and Pensions helped countless people navigate bureaucratic systems and access services they needed. His volunteer work with Manchester's Polish immigrant community provided language instruction, cultural guidance, and emotional support that helped newcomers establish successful lives in Britain. His willingness to open his home to people who needed housing and support created opportunities for others to achieve stability and independence. These contributions to his community represent the true measure of Stuart's life and the lasting impact he had on other people's success and well-being. Although Marson has been convicted and sentenced, the investigation into Stuart's murder remains technically open due to the large number of missing remains. Manchester Police continue to follow up on tips and information that might lead to additional recovery sites. The case has also prompted changes in how police handle missing person investigations, particularly those involving vulnerable adults who might be victims of financial exploitation or domestic violence. The surveillance footage analysis techniques developed during the heavy Bagman investigation have provided valuable experience for future cases involving methodical disposal of evidence across multiple locations. Stuart Everett deserved to live out his retirement years surrounded by the community he had served so faithfully, continuing to help immigrants build new lives while enjoying the respect and affection of everyone who knew him. Instead, he was betrayed and murdered by someone who saw his generosity as weakness and his trust as an opportunity for exploitation. The scattered remains across Manchester serve as a reminder that some crimes leave wounds that never fully heal, affecting not just immediate family members, but entire communities that depended on the victim's presence and service. Marson Makovich's name will be forgotten, but Stuart Everett's legacy of service and sacrifice will continue to inspire others, to build communities based on mutual support rather than parasitic exploitation.